Hello and welcome to the screencast on lesson planning for young learners. We're going to start by looking at the table that I gave you on lesson patterns and sequences in young learner ELT literature. Now, I was a little bit curious myself as a trainer about the different frameworks for lesson plans in general for young learners. For adults, they are very clear, but for young learners, they're not so clear. So what I did was I went and read 8 different books, trying to look for different patterns and identify these patterns. So what I did was I put what I found out from those books, I basically put into this table. So, looking at Halliwell and what she says about vocabulary, basically she says that, Susan Halliwell, she mentions different steps here that you can see on how to address vocabulary. Obviously, vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, they're all different. So this is only for how she suggests addressing vocabulary. Susan Halliwell has written extensively about work with primary school in both native speaking and non-native speaking English countries. So obviously this has been tried and tested. So basically she says briefly introduce words, write down a number, true, false statements, memory, true or false, energetic, true, false activities, repeating, repetition, disappearing cars, guess what, paired guess what, recognition, reading aloud. Very important, you can see that writing comes at the very end. Now, these activities that you can see here, they're all related, let's say, about food words. So you would be doing food words with activity number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. And so there's a constant repetition and recycling of the vocabulary. Now, here on the course, we're using Footprints by Carol Reed, very famous as well. We're using Footprints 1. And basically, she identifies and suggests the following lesson stages for the lessons throughout the book. I went and looked at every single unit and they do repeat, basically. So there is a pattern. There's always the suggested framework for a 60-minute lesson. However, here we're doing 40-minute lessons. Obviously, these times and timings are flexible and you can adapt them if you have longer lessons. So basically, there's always a greetings and opening routine, a revision activity from the previous lesson, then telling students what we're going to be looking at so that they are aware of the work to be done. Then the main part of the lesson, there's a very heavy focus on vocabulary presentation and lots of integrated skills. So, for example, the main focus of the lesson in Unit 1 is my birthday. Here we have that it starts with flashcards and a presentation of vocabulary, then is followed by follow the footprints, where there's a listening, there's plus work on the page, plus line drawing. There's then another listening and singing and pointing. Then they do some drawing and coloring and saying things. They read, match and say. They find, color and write. Different stages, different exercises. Very important to notice again that at very low levels, beginner elementary levels, with very young learners and young learners like the ones we have, writing comes at the very end. Now, ending the lesson with a quick review, self-reflection, then the routine closing, which is usually a goodbye song, which changes throughout the book, and then homework. Those are the stages suggested. I also looked at Scott and Eiderberg, and they suggest basically for very young learners 5 to 7 25-minute lessons which follow these stages. Then call the register, revision for previous lesson, have a quick dialogue where the language is embedded, work on the target language from the dialogue, and form the target language form in the dialogue, then listen again and tell what they can see, and then a craft stage. For the 9-year-olds, a 40-minute lesson, so slightly older, they suggest starting with a song, listen and tell me how many or how much, repeat the dialogue for the students, do some prompt work, then reading some multiple choice questions, multiple comprehension questions as well, not only multiple choice. Then writing at the end, students write shopping list for a dialogue. Be very careful and bear in mind that the kind of writing would definitely be at the student's level. So writing is not that they're going to write a paragraph or an essay. Depending on the level, they will be doing very simple writing things, and then crafts. Now, Jane Moon, also very famous, she says basically that focus on defining what to teach is more important than anything, that you should start with the what, identifying the what, and then the how. So that's when you're planning your lesson. And then plan in terms of what they need, they know, and what is new. There's no point in telling them what they already know. Now, a sample lesson for 8 to 9-year-olds, she suggests these 9 stages. So a warm-up and revision, picture or alike to introduce the topic, establish interest, activate prior knowledge. And as you can see, you're probably thinking already, I can see some that some of the stages here are very similar to the ones for teaching adults and what you probably saw on the CELTA. So yes, you can see that some stages are very similar. So you have a warm-up, you have a picture to establish context, activate prior knowledge, always very important. Ask students to make predictions about the topic because that's related to activating prior knowledge. Also, then they do an activity where they do some listening in color. Then there's tell first part of the story with actions and pictures. So you're recycling, it's always recycling with your learners. Then get students to compare their drawings for some mental engagement. Students to orally describe colors of little fish if this is in the story, or characters in the story. Followed by some feedback. You get some feedback by asking students what they thought about the story in L1 if necessary. Now, it's very important to mention that very often people say like, oh no, you shouldn't be using L1 in the classroom. Well, the younger they are, sometimes you need to just give them the word they need. If the concept is abstract, they're not going to get it through verbal input. Maybe gesture in mind will help, but if it is abstract, just give it to them, double check, try and establish the meaning. Check whether they know it already in Italian, in Italian and Spanish in their first language, and then move on. So there is a place for language for their L1 in the classroom. And then display students' work on the walls because this gives them a sense of achievement. Now, the next side of the table, we have Moon continues with some ideas, and then it says basically there's no right format. It depends on your objectives, needs of your students, and there is a suggested follow-up for a story, for the little fish story. Now, this is very, very, very important. There's no right format. We can see that there are patterns that work. In your own experience, you may find that some things that you do, some routines are very efficient and effective. So continue to do those. The idea behind this screencast is that after having surveyed the literature, what's available in my own experience, then I wanted to give you some guidelines to try and help you make sense. Now, it says there's no right format. It depends on your objectives and your students' needs, the needs of your students. She suggests, for example, here in that little fish story, so fishy names, so things students think of a name and age for their fish, so personalizing it, write it on the back, and pairs give this information, then they read and spot the difference. The teacher writes a description of fish and story on the whiteboard with students' help, then read in color, then complete the worksheet, and then dramatize it. Now, we also have Lynn Cameron on teaching English to young learners. So she has written a very different books, and teaching English to young learners is very good. She says advanced versus online planning and the use of choice points where the students choose what to focus on as the lesson develops. So obviously you're giving them some flexibility there. She suggests finding the theme, planning the context, maybe through brainstorming and webs. Guiding questions through brainstorming can lead the theme as a whole. And then the stages, basically she says there should be a preparation stage where you pre-teach vocabulary or activate schemata. There's a core activity to set up through language learning goals, and then a follow-up activity where there's some speaking or writing, and where the performance is based on what was done in the core activity. So all related. Cameron, addressing grammar specifically, says, well, in noticing, then they can listen and notice and then complete or tick a grid, or give you some sort of response. Remember, that's the only way we can check that they understand it. There's a response to the listening or reading input, in this case, whatever it is that you have planned in your lesson. Then the presentation of target language in with puppets, for example, that they go down very well with the young learners because they love them. They're still in that fantasy world. Then structuring, so helping students to internalize the grammar patterns through questionnaires, surveys, quizzes, infograph activities. Helping hands, so they draw their hands and fill in each finger with target language. There's drills and chants. Remember, again, the kind of writing they do is at their level, so they wouldn't be writing an email or a letter, not really, if they're very young, because it would be beyond their ability. Then Cameron also mentions proceduralizing, so for students to automate their use of grammar, describing activities, maybe a dict-to-gloss activity. Pinter, moving on, says that sample lessons focus on listening and speaking only, as students in this context have not done any reading or writing, especially the very young learners. So that's true of very young learners, and the lower the level, then the more true this is. An example could be a listen and match, a game and drama. Another example of a lesson could be a chant, a listen and do, and then a mingling game, where the focus again is mainly on listening and speaking. Sample 3, maybe a song, a gap speaking task, and then a craft. Throughout, with very young learners, they're usually picking up the language incidentally. So all the instructions and the things that we tell them, and we support that with gestures and body language and visuals. Finally, Hotspot, which is the other book we're using with the intermediates, with the senior group, 11, 12, 13-year-olds. Basically, there are two parts. The lessons are divided into two parts. There's always a warmer at the beginning of the lesson, then text-based presentation, where the language is obviously going to be embedded in it. There's a reading and listening, and then the grammar spot, which focuses on the language based, embedded in the reading or listening. The second part of the lesson involves a prediction task for listening and reading, vocabulary or pronunciation or writing, and then some feedback. Let's move on to tips on planning for young learners. So for the younger learners, this is the same handout that you got. It says the following is a suggested lesson framework which suits the footprint series. All the same, it is also very clear and coherent framework which you may want to adopt in the future for younger learners to ensure the lesson has a clear structure. I mean, needless to say, this also means students will be able to see the established routine with the added benefits. As discussed in class, please refer to the lesson pattern sequences in Young Learner ELT literature table given, as it summarizes 8 different sources and the stages suggested in them. As regards timing, please note that these are suggested time frames for the 40-minute lessons you're bound to deliver while on the Young Learner Extension to CELTA course. So these are flexible and can be adapted for longer lessons. Please note I use standard CELTA terminology below to help you see the matching stages, or pretty much the equivalents. Now, let's take a look at this table here. Basically, here are the timings, suggested timings. I've tried to make a match or find the equivalent so that you can see how it works. So with younger learners, we always have the same thing as a leading and warmer in this case. And with this course book, which is Footprints, we use an opening song, but it has the same effect. Then revision, what we did, quick revision of what we did on the previous lesson. What in CELTA terminology, if we follow a PPP approach, the presentation is also a presentation, and with young learners, the only difference is that it is done differently. Now, the presentation can be about language, grammar, vocabulary, functions, pronunciation, or skills, language, listening, reading, writing, speaking. Now, Please look at the asterisks and what it says down here. Please note that although I'm referring to the PPP framework, which is used for language, grammar, vocabulary, function, pronunciation, with younger learners, we tend to include skills under the presentation, although you're not presenting. So we're doing with younger learners is more integrated skills work. Especially when they're for the younger spectrum of the young learners. This is done here just so that you can see where they fit in the lesson stages in comparison to teaching adults. Now, in the course book, this is the repeater pattern. They start with the vocabulary presentation with the flashcards. So this specific course book has a very heavy emphasis on vocabulary, and usually with younger learners with very low ability, what we do is build out their vocabulary so that they can start communicating, so that reflects that. Then it says there's a section called Follow the Footprints, where they listen and do something, then they listen again and sing, listen again and point, then they listen and draw, listen and color, listen and read, listen and match, listen and find, color and write. So please note that the writing, if any, comes at the very end of that section. After this, we have the practice, which for adults we would say, well, obviously we want practice which is control for accuracy. Here, and then production freer for fluency. Here we have basically around 10 minutes. We suggest about 10 minutes for the follow-up, which is speaking and writing. And is when we ask them to do something where they can actually use this language we presented here and they worked on here. Now, please be aware of the fact that when I say presentation, doesn't mean teacher-led or teacher-fronted or teacher in charge. Presentation can be done where the students are at the center of the heart of the lesson, not you. Remember, you're here for the students, not for you to be the star. Now, that's followed by an end in the lesson, 2 minutes. In this case, we always have a closing song for the students. Now, let's move on and let's look at the bit that we have down here. Basically, it says, since you're all teaching a 2-hour slot here, then the lesson would not need an opening or closing stage after each teacher has taught their 40-minute lesson. The 2-hour lesson would look like this. We're going to look at what the lesson would look like for the 2 hours and how the different slots work. Here we go. So we have slot 1, roughly 40 minutes. Opening song, as we said before, you have the stage and the stage aim. So we have an opening song to warm up the students through a familiar activity. However, just because it is suggested an opening song here, it doesn't mean that you must always have an opening song. You can have a warmer or an activity that will warm them up and prepare them for the lesson. In the course book that we're using, that's what they suggest and that's what we're using because it helps them with the routine. Then a quick revision of what they did in the previous lesson, and then we start our presentation, which provides students with language and skills work. This is usually combined in young learner lessons. Obviously, sometimes you may be focusing, depending on the topic that we give you in the book, maybe language, sometimes it's going to be skills. However, most of the time, skills work is integrated in the language. Now, the aim for language gives students the opportunity to become aware of /notice patterns. This is not usually done explicitly. And skills give students opportunity to develop their linguistic skills, but as I said before, this is usually done in an integrated way. Then you have a follow-up where you would be doing some control and freer practice, and this is to give the students the opportunity to practice in a control and then freer way, to practice obviously what you did here. Now, that's the end of your 40-minute slot. There's a 1-minute break, transition for the next teacher. Let's move this up. And then we're on to the next teacher, the second slot, 40 minutes again. You don't need an opening song or a warmer, so you can start with a revision or in the form of a warmer or a warmer itself. for your middle slot. Then the presentation, we repeat the process as before, so I'm not going to go through it again. So you would be focusing on either language or skills depending on what you've been given, and then finishing up your slot with obviously a follow-up where they do some controlled and freer practice. Now, the candidates here, the lesson is 2 hours and 10 minutes, because here in the middle there's a 10-minute break, toilet break, water break, and then they come back for the last session, which is this one. Now, the last slot, the third person doing the slot, again, roughly 140 minutes, you would do, again, you don't need an opening sum. You would do a warmer or a revision of the previous slot, a quick revision. Your presentation, again, as above, either focusing on language or skills for the aims given here, followed by a control and freer practice. In this case, though, you have the last bit, which is the closing song. And that would be finish the lesson with the established routine. They're used to it. We make them, after the song, we make them get their bags, get ready, and then line up before we let them go. So, as you can see, it's something that repeats. The stages are clear. Make sure that in your lesson plans you do have clear stages like these ones here, so that it is clear where you're going, what you're doing, and above all, that you are always aware of the aims. It's very important that you have a very clear stage name and stage aim, so that you know, that you show us that you know what you're doing that. I hope this screencast is useful. It basically covers all the things we've been discussing, and it should give you the guidelines and a clear framework and steps to plan your lessons. Good luck.